So Enlisted has just released the latest event, and this is essentially the Enlisted birthday event. But did you know that Enlisted has a very interesting and complex history? Of course, most people don't know this because, well, one of the main things that most people don't realize is that how back Enlisted really goes when it comes to its development. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about the pre-release open beta, essentially the closed beta and everything before that. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the first few years of Enlisted. And if we're talking about the entire years in which Enlisted has been developed, then that's a lot of years. But without further ado, this video has been made possible for the friends at Discord. If you haven't liked, subscribed, or joined the Discord, highly suggest that you do. With that said, let's get started. Dungeon Entertainment and Dark Flow Software first announced the game in 2016 as a crowdfunded title. Two campaigns were focused on, the Battle of Moscow and the Invasion of Normandy were announced. The game was advertised as, quote, a first-person shooter decided by the fans for the fans and that. End quote. They will then have direct input into what we create, including things like campaigns, game models, and even platforms where PC we will support. Other campaigns will be unlocked if the crowd-funded goals were met. Crowdfunding tiers at the highest level will allow contributions, and contributors to choose which campaigns should be added next. By December 12, 2016, there were only officially 3 campaigns announced. The first was the Battle of Normandy, the second was the Battle of Moscow, and the third was the Battle of Tunisia, all of which were announced in that order and on the same day. As a matter of fact, the next day, the official game was then announced. 3 days later, on the 15th of December, Enlisted reached its first achievement rating 60,000, and by the 23rd, that reached 250,000. In the next year of January 17, 2017, they announced they were going to separate paid campaigns with free trial access, that they were going to readjust the game elements. Another thing that they teased was the release of Stalingrad, which, surprisingly enough, was announced all the way back then. On the 17th of February, they then announced they were going to add squads in-game with, quote, every player will receive their own squads under their command to lead, saturating the battlefield with participants, end quote. On April the 1st of 2017, they decided to add Xenos vs Marines into Enlisted, which is essentially Space Marines vs Aliens. The purpose of this entire thing was to test and see the squad-based mechanics of the game being implemented in Enlisted, but hell, I would not expect Enlisted and Space Marines to be in one game. That said, on the 17th of June, they released their first roadmaps, and some of the most interesting things include the synchronizing of battlefield items, character perks, and quick access inventory. They also had custom networking with large support battles even with low bandwidth, testing with gameplay, and lightweight editor enabling fast updates. They were also doing stress tests with AI to prioritize performance, and feedback will guide adjustments to combat and networking. They will also be planning to add melee weapons with the addition of the bayonet. They're also starting to work on backpacks and allowing you to carry more space for grenades. And finally, they were starting to work on bunkers and firing ports. During this time, they were also working on textures, in-game post-its, road signs, and graphical elements for certain locations such as the villages, and the massive addition of new weapons and pistols. By the end of December that same year, they were finishing with most of these and were now working on NetESC framework for game logic, which makes in-game better performances while also testing the network requirements. By April 2018, they announced that most of the things on the original roadmap were quote-unquote completed, and they were now working on quote-unquote weather diversity and other in-game developments. By June of 2018, they released their first test to a certain number of people via email. Yes, you heard that correct, via email. Like with Space Marines, Enlisted also during this time made Cuisine Royale, which is a game similar to Fortnite, with Enlisted locations, maps, and weapons. It features a number of things like survival boxes and all the way for Enlisted to test their new game, which is Enlisted. By August 21st of 2018, they released a new roadmap announcing the measures that they will be taking for their original roadmap, with plans to add other visual features like terrain and decals. On April the 1st of 2020, they then released their first playtest with Moscow being only available. Later then, they added the North American server, and if you're wondering, the playtest only lasted a day, essentially less than 24 hours. 3 days later, they came out with the results, and surprisingly, it was 45,000 participants, which is actually pretty good, considering it has been out less than a day. And they were mostly fought against other players, and back then, they even showed the stats of the different weapons with the most kills, which is interesting. On May the 6th of the same year, they announced the development of the Battle of Berlin, in which they released Berlin as a pre-alpha test, However, a day later they implement a massive graphic overhaul. They also give us a ton of new weapons. These include, but are not limited to, the T-34, the IS-2, the Panther G, the Tiger 2P, the RPZ-B-43 Panzerschreck, the RD-44, and among other things. A few days later, they came out with the results. About 47,000 players or participants. An interesting fact is now back then, Enlisted called the FG-42 Model 1 a machine gun, which is great. In June of that same year, they showed us a glimpse of what they had in store for Normandy, including armored vehicles, and a few days later they added a bunch of graphical changes with the tanks and added a flamethrowers. Finally, in November 10th, 2020, after 4 years of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, they officially released Enlisted to close beta testing. Ever since then, every year Enlisted's birthdays will be on November the 10th. Like with every year, it features a lot of premium squads. Back then, there were only 3, one being the German MP-41, one Soviet PPK-41, and of course, both of them in one package, which is great. Individually, they cost $29, and together they cost $47. What's more, they were only inviting those who supported Enlisted development by purchasing the Founder Pack into the CBT, closed beta testing, meaning, as of November 10th, 2020, it was not free to the public. That said, Enlisted is officially 1 year old. That means officially, Enlisted will be starting its first official year. With the start of the first official Enlisted year released to the public, the game got 5 updates. A few were regular updates, but one was called quote-unquote a large update. All of them were essentially weapon text features, bug fixes, graphical changes, and weapon balancing, such as the reload rate of the Kar 98K. On December 23rd, they released their first Normandy trailer, and when I mean December 23rd, I mean December 23rd of 2020. It was then announced for testing in December the 23rd to the 28th. Back then, there were only 3 maps: D-Day, La Brea, and Chateau. The testing was then extended from January 12th to the 18th of 2021, the next year. Between the time Enlisted also dropped their first Twitch drops. Essentially, this was when Enlisted players who watch on Twitch via certain content creators get certain unique items. The first ever Enlisted Twitch drop was on 1500 GMT time on the 8th of January until 1500 GMT time on the 11th of January. During this time, a person made 2 posts on YouTube, one of which was a video in which he was playing a game as the Soviet Union and got 334 kills in that game. On the other hand, he also posted the other video, which is the top 10 Enlisted tips and tricks for new players. The said YouTuber in question was Quadros, and although his first videos weren't Enlisted related, he will eventually become one of the most popular Enlisted content creators. Although Enlisted didn't publish the amount of players that they played during the quote-unquote Normandy event, quote, players have carried out 11,550 Normandy beach assaults and battles at La Brea and Chateau, and we have received more than 100 suggestions from you, end quote. A few days later, they released their findings for the Normandy campaigns as well as fixes here and there. By March of 2021, they gave Enlisted players a lot of new things. For example, they added Normandy as an official campaign with the addition of Enlisted being available on PlayStation 5. Back then, Normandy only had 18 levels, and this was still in the campaign system, mind you, and a few maps compared to this testing stage. They also dropped another Twitch drop on the 5th, and this time they did both War Thunder and Enlisted in one Twitch sitting, essentially wanting War Thunder players to try out Enlisted. This was apparently due to War Thunder having a more massive influence on Enlisted, and one of them is like a child, with War Thunder being the parent. And more importantly, Gaijin, the creator of War Thunder, was one of the developers, as I stated in the beginning of the video. On the 5th, Enlisted said they were quote-unquote planning to introduce new ways to obtain rewards and be able to customize your own squads, end quote. A few days later, they then did a few minor updates, but interestingly enough, disabled the ability to PC players to cross-play against console players. This was done by popular demand. On the 25th, Enlisted then introduced the Battle Pass, the Battle Task, and combat rewards, such as Best on Team. They also reworked the composition of squads by changing the max amount of soldiers for certain squads. For example, sniper squads can only get a certain number of squad mates. That said, on the 26th of May 2021, Enlisted announced their plans for open beta, which is actually planned for April the 8th, 2021. Remember, during this entire time, you essentially had to pay for closed beta. That said, the announcement came with the usual amount of premium squads, which were on sale, but instead of the massive amounts of premium squads we have right now in Enlisted in 2024, you only had 4 back then, so that's great. During this time, another YouTuber named Enlightened Enlisted made a video of titling Engineers are OP in Enlisted. All of this is to show how Enlisted has been steadily getting more and more attention, even during its closed beta testing phase. In April, Enlisted announced the development of landmines, of which there were 2, anti-tank and anti-personnel. They also announced new maps that were in development. These included the Fortified District, the Collective Farm, and a few days later in April, they announced the Battle Pass has officially arrived, of which there were 60 levels with 75 days to complete them. They also added in the Gold Order weapons, of which back then there were only one per campaign. The Soviets got the Berdan, the Germans got the Gewehr 1888, and the Schmeisse MK35 for Normandy, while the Americans got the Springfield M1903 Pedersen device. One interesting thing to note is that during this time they took away the ability for premium squads to add members or change their composition. On April the 8th, they announced the open beta testing for Enlisted. This came with a massive Twitch drop updates and battle improvements for the next foreseeable few weeks. By the end of April, Enlisted has already announced the closed beta testing for Berlin. That said, that is all it for the beginning of Enlisted, an interesting and unique development phase for the game itself. But without further ado, what do you think about Enlisted's development? Comment in the comment section down below, and I'll see you in the next one.